Code of Ethics and Standards of Practice for Spoken Language Interpreters. This presentation will review the Spoken Language Interpreter Code of Ethics and Standards of Practice, and give you the opportunity to apply this knowledge to realistic scenarios in school settings. It is important to remember that the Code of Ethics is a guide that can provide you with a general path to take when confronted with certain dilemmas. However, the Code of Ethics will not provide you with all the answers needed to guide your practice as a professional interpreter. Your professional judgment, your status as a school-based or contracted interpreter, and other factors will need to be taken into account when making ethical decisions. The National Association of Educational Translators and Interpreters of Spoken Languages, or NATISL, published a nationally vetted Code of Ethics in 2021 and revised it in 2022 after conducting several focus groups with educators, school-based interpreters, translators, freelance interpreters, school district leaders, and other stakeholders to define the principles that guide the work of spoken language interpreters in education. Feel free to use this document as your reference when ethical dilemmas arise in your practice. Let's start reviewing the principles of our Code of Ethics. Confidentiality involves honoring the private and personal nature of the educational interaction, maintaining trust among all parties, and being in constant compliance with the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA. FERPA is a federal law that protects the privacy of student education records. The law applies to all schools that receive funds under an applicable program of the U.S. Department of Education. FERPA gives parents certain rights with respect to their children's education records. This includes protecting the right to inspect and review the student's education records, correct the records if needed, and require the school has written permission from the parent to release any information from a student's education record, with some exceptions. Confidentiality is very important in the interpretation encounter, and it is another ethical standard that differentiates a bilingual person from a trained interpreter. A trained interpreter must keep all information learned in the performance of their professional duties confidential except if required by law. What would be an exception to this rule? If the interpreter suspects any type of abuse, such as child abuse or domestic abuse, or if the interpreter feels that the parent or student is in danger or may harm themselves or others. Confidentiality means that the interpreter does not discuss a student's or parent's case with family or community members and only discusses information with members of the educational team as needed. The interpreter must also protect written information related to the student or parent. This means securing report cards, transcripts, and other information that does not need to be left in public view. It also involves discarding notes that you may have taken during an interpretation session. We will talk about note-taking while interpreting, but for now, let's remember that these notes are also part of the records that the interpreter needs to protect. Think about how to protect confidentiality as an independent interpreter and as a school-based interpreter. Also consider some of the things you need to keep in mind to protect the family's and students' privacy and information if you want to work as an in-person or remote interpreter. Impartiality may be one of the most difficult standards to maintain because sometimes you may be very tempted to get involved and advise or redirect either the educator or the parent. Being impartial takes discipline and trust in both the school staff and the parent to know what is best for them. Impartiality refers to the elimination of the effect of interpreter bias or preference. Interpreters cannot counsel, advise, or project personal biases or beliefs and do not allow their own personal judgments or cultural values to influence objectivity. For example, an interpreter whose own child has been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder cannot counsel a parent about the school interventions that will benefit or not benefit the student. The interpreter can, however, at a separate time, express their concerns to the school and let the school personnel decide what to share with the parent. Transparency is key here, and both parties must feel that they can trust you to be a neutral voice in the conversation. If you are a bilingual school-based interpreter, impartiality may not be as easy to define because you may be playing many roles at the same time. If, for example, you are a bilingual counselor collaborating as an interpreter, your duty as a counselor is to advise and guide, while your duty as an interpreter is to remain impartial. When conflicts related to impartiality arise, your priority is to inform parties of such dilemmas and ask for support and guidance from your school leaders. Perhaps they can assign another interpreter if your professional objectivity will be affected, or allow you to interpret with the understanding that you will remain a neutral party in the situation. It is crucial that the interpreter discloses potential conflicts of interest, withdrawing from assignments where such conflict of interest may, in reality, exist or appear to exist. For example, an interpreter avoids interpreting for a family member or close friend, or for neighbors, as in these cases it is hardly impossible to remain neutral. Some school districts no longer allow family members or friends to interpret for families unless the school can have a neutral school interpreter in the room at the same time. In this case, the family member and or friend can proceed with interpretation, allowing the trained school interpreter to intervene when a term is not explained correctly, or when an explanation is needed. There are two simple tools that the interpreter can use to help maintain impartiality. One is using the first person when interpreting, and the other is positioning. Let's talk a little bit about those two concepts. When an interpreter speaks in the first person, they literally become the voice for each party. For example, instead of saying, "The teacher says that he is upset about the student's attitude," the interpreter would say, "I feel upset about the student's attitude." This will help the parent and the school personnel understand that the interpreter is there as a voice and not as part of the conversation. So you may want to introduce this concept in your pre-session by saying, "I, the interpreter, will interpret everything you say in the first person." That means I will use "I" when the interpreter or parent speaks, as if I was that person. This will help highlight the fact that I am a neutral party in the conversation. Positioning means physically putting yourself in a place where you can facilitate communication without interfering. You should be seen and heard by both parties, but should position yourself in the place that is least disruptive to direct communication between the educator and parent. Depending on the setup of the room, this may mean in the middle of both parties, making sure that educators and teachers can observe each other's body language in the process. Accuracy refers to the effort that interpreters make to render the message accurately, conveying the content and spirit of the original message, taking into consideration the cultural context. The number one duty in terms of accuracy is for the interpreter to render all messages accurately and completely, without adding, omitting, or substituting. This means repeating all that is said, even if it seems redundant or irrelevant, as the interpreter is not there to filter or select information to relay. The interpreter, at the same time, must also replicate the register, style, and tone of the speaker. For example, if the interpreter notices that the parent or the student does not understand an educational term, the interpreter may ask the teacher or the school administrator to reword or re-express the term, or perhaps provide an example for the benefit of the family. The interpreter must not take it upon themselves to explain these concepts on their own without involving the school personnel. The interpreter must remain transparent and assist with communication without interfering with the relationship and trust that the school personnel is building with the family. Part of being accurate in your interpretation involves intervening when necessary. For example, when a speaker is going too fast or when someone has said a word or concept for which you need further description. The interpreter must also correct errors in interpretation. For example, an interpreter who has omitted an important word corrects the mistake as soon as possible. The bottom line is to maintain the communication flow and transparency by making sure that everyone in the room is informed of what you are doing. Because remember, oftentimes, the only one in the room that knows both sides of the story is you. You have a great deal of responsibility to relay information accurately because you may be the only one with full knowledge of both languages. Therefore, your goal is to provide equity in communication. What about variations within a language? Many languages have a standard or universal version that you can use for most of the conversation. However, there may be a time when you may need to use a specific word that may not be standard, but may be better understood by a family. In this case, it is important that you relay this information to the educators to keep informed of your choice to use a colloquialism or Anglicism that a family is more likely to understand. The idea is to ensure that the family and the educators remain connected and engaged in the conversation, and that you disclose, either before, during, or after the meeting, the choices you made to support clear communication. Here are some examples of words that in Spanish can be interpreted in many different ways, depending on the country where the language is spoken. Interpreters must become familiar with these language variations and be prepared to select a word that may be more commonly used by the parent while protecting the accuracy of the message. Culture is often overlooked in interpretation encounters when in fact it is truly an essential component that can help build or break trust and improve or create barriers in communication. Interpreters must strive to develop awareness of the cultures encountered in the performance of interpreting duties. This means that the interpreter strives to understand the cultures associated with the languages they interpret, including the educational culture, and represents the non-speaker of that language in the most culturally appropriate manner possible. This could mean, for example, learning about the grading system and school requirements of countries where the student's or parent's language is spoken. In many cultures, teachers are viewed as the authority figures, and one is not to argue, ask questions, or discuss educational matters with them because they know best. Therefore, the entire concept of family engagement and parental participation in school may be completely foreign to many parents who were educated in other countries. Asking a parent if they have any questions or comments about the interventions that the school is trying to implement with the student may seem out of place for some parents who, although they may have many questions, will say that everything is clear out of respect for the teacher and their authority. The interpreter must alert all parties to any significant cultural misunderstanding that arises. For example, if a teacher recommends that a student who is fasting for religious reasons eat a good breakfast before testing, an interpreter may call attention to the potential conflict. Or if a parent uses an expression or saying that, when interpreted literally, may result in a misunderstanding, the interpreter must intervene to provide cultural context before proceeding. It is very important, however, that interpreters share cultural context with the understanding that their insight does not reflect that of the entire population. Generalizations about specific cultures, values, or behaviors may lead to stereotypes and preconceptions about the family or the community in general. There are a couple of videos that I'd like to direct you to. One is The Danger of a Single Story, which gives an amazing description of our tendency to look at one angle and one page of a person's story. This is a video that encourages us to think beyond our first impressions and understand that each person is a different world. The second video was produced by Natizzle and covers the difference between cultural competency and cultural humility and how we, as individuals, can practice this lifelong cultural self-assessment in our work as interpreters. Links to both of these videos can be found in the resource section of this module. One of the easiest ways to practice cultural humility and demonstrate respect for our colleagues, families, and educators is to be aware of our nonverbal communication and our body language. Oftentimes, when families are in the process of acquiring English, they are more keenly aware of a person's body language. Keeping track of our expressions and mannerisms can ensure that we communicate the same messages that we are relaying verbally. Are we being welcoming? Are we prejudging a family or an educator who we work with? What are we really saying with our nonverbal communication? Professionalism includes being prepared for all assignments and disclosing skill limitations with respect to particular assignments. Just like any other professional, the interpreter is not expected to know every term that will be explained, and the interpreter must inform all parties when a meeting should be covered by an interpreter trained in a more advanced tier if needed. Part of being a professional interpreter is also advocating for working conditions that support quality interpreting. For example, an interpreter on a lengthy assignment indicates when fatigue might compromise interpreting accuracy. An interpreter assigned to assist with a meeting that they know will take 3 to 4 hours needs to have a backup plan or someone else to come to assist if needed. Lastly, an interpreter reflects professionalism when they dress appropriately and arrive on time for appointments. Arriving early can give the interpreter the opportunity to study the vocabulary needed for the encounter, speak to the school personnel about information that they are not sure about before the parent arrives, and clarify the goals of the interpretation session that is about to happen. A great tool that educational interpreters can use to reflect their professionalism is the pre-session. As we learned in Module 1, the pre-session is a brief conversation that the interpreter should have with the parent and the school staff member prior to the interpretation session. The pre-session has many important objectives. The first one is to help interpreters establish themselves as professionals and allow time to explain the interpretation process. The pre-session can also help to promote trust between the interpreter, school staff, parents, or guardians by setting the tone of the session. In addition, during the pre-session, the interpreter can determine the level of register needed for the specific audience and also the mode of interpretation most beneficial for conducting the message. So, in essence, the interpreter is establishing the guidelines needed for effective interpretation, defining the role in the encounter, and identifying what they need from the other parties to promote equity in communication. Let's look at the components of a pre-session. The pre-session must be brief and include the following: the interpreter's name and the agency they work with, if applicable, a statement regarding confidentiality and the protection of the students' and parents' privacy, a statement in reference to the interpreter's duty to relay everything spoken by either party without omissions or changes to the meaning. In the pre-session, you will need a statement to request for both parties, parent and school staff, to address each other directly, as if the interpreter was not there. You will also state that everything said will be interpreted. This includes side conversations that either the parent or the school staff decide to have. Oftentimes, warning all parties of this up front avoids losing the focus of the interpretation encounter and reminds parents and school staff that the interpreter is a communication bridge, but not part of the conversation. If you are interpreting in consecutive mode, you will need to remind all parties that they must pause frequently to allow for accurate interpreting. You will also need a statement regarding the possibility of the interpreter having to intervene for clarification. There may be a word you didn't understand in the native or target language, or an idiom or jargon that slipped in that you are not sure about, or better yet, an abbreviation that you think you know but are not sure about. It is always better to ask for clarification than to make meaning assumptions so you can interpret accurately. Now keep in mind that these are the main components of a pre-session and that you can add whatever other statements you feel you need in specific situations. For example, if you are interpreting remotely, your pre-session may need to include information about side conversations via chat and how you must include them in your interpretation, and an assurance that you are the only one in the room and that no one else is listening to the conversation as you interpret. You do have to keep it brief and must relay the same information in the native language and the target language so everyone understands the rules. In the Natizzle website, you can find samples of pre-sessions in 13 different languages. They can serve as a guide to create your personalized vision with details specific to your setting, whether you are a school-based or freelance interpreter. Professional boundaries are related to impartiality. This is when you define the scope and limits of the interpreting role to avoid conflicts of interest. The interpreter must refrain from personal involvement and not share or elicit overly personal information in conversations with a parent or a student. The interpreter is present to be a voice and a bridge in communication, and is not there to advise a parent or a student regarding educational questions or decisions, but can find ways to redirect the parent or the student to ask an educator or administrator. As we mentioned previously, many school-based interpreters may have other roles such as being a teacher, counselor, school principal, and others. It is important that while interpreting, the professional adheres to all interpreting standards of practice. They must maintain their roles as conduits of information and refrain from bringing their other duties into the conversation. Interpreters with dual roles can use the pre-session to emphasize and clarify their role as the interpreter for the parents and educators. Professional development has to do with achieving the highest possible level of competence and service by expanding your knowledge and skills through independent study, continuing education, and actual interpreting practice. The interpreter should continue to develop language and cultural knowledge and interpreting skills and stay up to date on changes in educational terminology or regional slang. The interpreter should also seek feedback to improve his or her performance. For example, an interpreter consults with colleagues about a challenging assignment and, on occasion, asks that another qualified interpreter observe an encounter to provide honest and useful feedback. Your best supporters are other interpreters who know exactly what the job entails. The interpreter must also support the professional development of fellow interpreters. For example, an experienced interpreter mentors novice interpreters and participates in organizations and activities that contribute to the development of the profession. This can entail attending professional development workshops and conferences that can help build on skills needed to move from one tier to another. Now, let's look at some examples of situations you may encounter where your code of ethics can serve as a guide. Take a look at this situation and think about the choice you would make. Think about why you selected that option and what would happen if you choose not to intervene at all. Remember, the code of ethics is a spectrum of choices, so you may choose more than one answer for these situations. In this situation, choices 1 and 4 are definitely out. We must allow parents to express their ideas freely without interfering. We must also not ignore the expression, as our responsibility is not to filter or omit any information we hear from either party. There are many variables in each situation, and thus, either choice 2 or 3 may be your best path. You may choose to intervene right after you hear the parent's expression to clarify before any confusion may arise, or you can choose to interpret it as is and allow the teachers to take the lead in clarifying through you what the parent meant by the expression. This is when your professional judgment comes into play, and it also depends on the expression used and how it may impact the clarity of the message. Let's look at another example. In this situation, choices 2 and 3 violate your responsibility of maintaining confidentiality and protecting the privacy of students, parents, and educators. Your best approach may be to ask the parent to schedule a meeting with the teacher to talk about the specific issues pertaining to the child. This choice allows you to go back to being an interpreter and relaying messages between the two parties. Some interpreters argue that if you are a school-based interpreter, for example, your duty may also include engaging and educating parents about a new educational system. Therefore, choice number 4 may also come into place as you share information about specific school policies and regulations that the parent may not be familiar with. Let's look at one last example. This may happen very often in our settings. Choices 1 and 2 may not be the best approach. We must ensure that families and educators receive the most accurate and complete information through a trained professional. Educators should have the responsibility of deciding who will interpret in this meeting, and the best practice is to allow a professional and trained interpreter to take the lead. School-based interpreters should take any opportunity they have to discuss these types of situations with educators so that when something like this happens, all parties are aware of how to proceed. It is best practice to allow a trained independent interpreter or school-based interpreter to relay the information between educators and families as opposed to a family friend or relative. Impartiality is key here, and family members or family friends who are not trained interpreters may be inclined to omit or filter information that a trained interpreter would not. A trained interpreter may also have additional knowledge about the terminology used during the meeting, which can help communication flow better. However, if for any reason the educator decides that the bilingual friend should interpret, perhaps because the family insists, or the family friend is in fact a trained interpreter, it is still recommended that the independent interpreter or school-based interpreter stay in the meeting just in case the family friend does not know specific terms.